We are the animal that's wired to internalize the ways of the communities that nurture us. We're sort of wired to learn cultures and drop a kid down in a new culture and they will learn it very quickly. But we are nurtured by a lot of different communities as we go through our life. It might be the school that we're in, and then maybe the religion that we're brought up in. And then, we go to a college, we learn a profession, we join an organization with a strong culture. We go to these different communities and we internalize, but these internalized cultures, they can't all drive at once.
All right. Welcome to the show, Michael. Great to have you.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I know it seems today, coming out of the election, and it feels like every 4 years, tribalism becomes a dirty word. And a lot of us look at it in a very negative light. But what I loved about the book is you actually unpack the reasons behind it evolutionarily, why it's important and how it's helped our survival. So why is it a blessing, as you write in the book?
Well, it got us out of the Stone Age, as you're alluding to. Tribal psychology is the set of capacities and motivations we have that enable us to form communities, to be part of culture sharing groups. And that's really the killer app of humanity. It's not that our candle power is that much higher than chimpanzees, but we have this collective brain in the form of, the legacies of shared knowledge. 99% of what I know or what you know, we didn't figure out for ourselves. We inherited it from, school or just watching people around us. So, we live kind of marinated in these cultures of groups, and that's what makes us so adept at everything. Now, does it sometimes lead us to be a little too focused on our own group and dismissive of other groups and in a way that's problematic? Yeah, sometimes. But I think that the pundits, the newspaper pundit class has done us a bit of a misservice in the way that they've seized on the idea of tribalism, and the way that they usually write about it, making it as dramatic as possible, is to say that there's like an innate animosity for outsiders, a drive to hate, a fear and loathing that's genetically, we're predisposed to. And, you know, that's not a picture of tribal instincts that any behavioral scientists or evolutionary scientists would recognize. Our tribal instincts are 99% about building solidarity within a community. They're not focused on outgroups. Our evolutionary forebears didn't have that much contact with outgroups. There wasn't, the population density was very low. Maybe once every 10 years they would meet another tribe, but they met each other every day. And that's what was important in evolution, to be good at building trust and collaborating with the people of your own group. And so that's what we're wired for. And it can go awry, especially when you're in different conditions and you get feedback loops and stuff. But it's a mistake to think that our conflicts in politics or other things, that they start from hostility. They may end up involving some hostility, but they don't start from hostility. None of our instincts are perfectly designed. Like we're wired to be attracted to sweet things, so that our ancestors would get fruit and get vitamins from it. Now, if you live on a block with a couple donut shops, you're probably going to overeat because of that instinct. But that doesn't mean that it's a gluttony instinct. It's a vitamin C instinct. It just goes awry in this particular environment. And I think likewise with, like the conflict between the red and the blue parties, it's not a reflection of some innate need to hate some outgroup. It comes out of our solidarity instincts, and the end result is that we don't trust the other side, and we've kind of really become polarized. But I think diagnosing it in terms of what science can really tell us about our tribal instincts, the sort of the human specific social instincts, is helpful, because if you don't diagnose something correctly, you're not going to see ways to remediate it. You're not going to see ways to intervene. Just like with any limitation that a person might have, you got to understand the source of it in order to help somebody out.
And it seems with that, socialization is a huge part of tribalism, whereas what the media paints is obviously in-group, out-group, and the negative side effects. But a lot of what you talk about in the book is our powerful ability to socialize together, share that knowledge, and lead to prosperity for the group that we're in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of efficiencies to working collectively as a united force as opposed to each person for themselves, whether we're hunter gatherers, hunting or, trying to gather stuff or whether we're working in a company today. There are some people who are really, really good individual producers, but unless they learn how to work well with other people and find the synergies with other people, their careers are usually pretty limited.
And looking through that lens, you talk about the social brain hypothesis and how important it is to be a social species. So I know some members of our audience might not be familiar with that. So what is the social brain hypothesis, and how does it impact us tribally?
So this comes out of the area of anthropology where they kind of ask themselves, how did we become this big brain species? Like the other great apes, like chimpanzees, are already brainiacs. They already have much higher ratio of brain to body size than most other mammals. The rank ordering is kind of funny because it's like humans, whales and dolphins, and then chimpanzees, and then like dogs are not far behind. Squirrels are way up there. They have pretty big heads relative to their body. Elephants, cats are way down the list. So some of my friends have been upset to read about that cats are not nearly as brainy as dogs or squirrels or other things. But chimpanzees are already really brainy, but then we have brains 3 times larger than them. And so it was kind of a mystery of like, why did they evolve? Because they have a lot of evolutionary costs. Something like 20% of our calories are spent right up here. And so, what advantage did our brains give us that justified the cost, in evolution? Because evolution is all about cost benefit. And for a long time, they just took for granted that it must be that bigger brains give a creature more mastery over the physical environment. And so it was just assumed that, first chimpanzees and then humans, we developed these big brains because it would help us like memorize the terrain and help us get a bigger variety of food sources and help us build tools, etc. But then a couple of interesting researchers who were both experts on the brain and experts on primates and monkeys, they did studies to try to test that. And what they found is that if you look across all the primate species, the bigger brain ones don't have a larger terrain. They don't necessarily use tools more. They don't have a greater variety of fruit in their diet. But what they do differently is that they live in larger groups. They have more complicated mating procedures. They have more organized social lives and more sort of synergy that comes from, an organized social group. So the revelation was that it was mastery over the social environment, not mastery over the physical environment, that our brains grew for. And then once we started doing social neuroscience, these studies where you hook people up to an fMRI machine and you look at what part of their brains light up, we realized that there's a whole system for social cognition in the brain that's different from the part of the brain that's like doing math. And that's in the forebrain. And that's a lot of what evolved, more recently, when we look at how human brains are different from chimpanzees and how, Homo sapien brains are different from what we can infer from skull shape about the brains of, the earliest archaic humans. So it's really the social brain that expanded and made us bigger brained. And because the real survival benefit was mastery over the social environment. And then, how does that play out today? Well, we all know about emotional intelligence and social intelligence, but, that area tends to emphasize, getting along with people. But there's also the game theory side of social intelligence, which is if, can you outthink the other side? And, if they have a bigger brain, then you have a bigger brain, then you need a bigger brain. So a lot of winning in the world, whether it's winning through cooperation or winning through competition, involves being able to think about other minds and being able to strategize about, well, how can I form a solid coalition with this person, and what's going to be the weakness in this person's strategy? So mind games, being able to get your mind around other minds, that's super important for success.
And it's a big part of the reason why when we become antisocial, it has such an impact on our physical and mental health. So we're wired with this big brain to socialize, to not only compete for resources, but collaborate for resources and share these traditions and pass this information on. And when we wall ourselves off, when we withdraw, when we actually face loneliness, it has serious impacts on our physical and mental health.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a worry. I think, my friend John Haidt has this book about, how kids using their phones too much, basically being on screen all day instead of roughhousing in the woods and doing that kind of stuff. It kind of makes them anxious and depressed. It used to be that happiness research, when psychologists first started getting like serious about, let's try to measure who's happy, they were measuring, sort of the amount of joy in people's lives, and they call it, hedonistic happiness. But at a certain point, they realized there's something missing from that equation, because they would look at when you have kids, your happiness went way down. So like, well, why are people having kids? And they realized, okay, well, there's this other kind of happiness that corresponds more to like fulfillment or a sense of meaning in your life. And they call that one, it's a Greek word, eudaimonistic happiness, hedonistic versus eudaimonistic. And I think they should get a better word, first of all. But, it's not like these Greek words, are even poetic to the ear. But that one goes up when you have kids. And basically, it's high for people, picture a person who's like keeping alive their family business, working 12 hours a day with all this drudgery, right? Why do they do it? Why don't they just retire? Why don't they just sell it? Well, because there's this deep meaning that comes from continuity and kind of preserving the community and preserving the tradition of your fathers and, passing it on to your children, right? So that drudgery, it's kind of like meaningful drudgery, and it gives people a sense of fulfillment, or you might be in the military and it's a hard slog, of logistics, moving a lot of people. Or it may be that for me, it's like grading papers, oh, why do I bother? Why don't I just retire and be an investor? Well, because I get some fulfillment out of the idea of helping the next generation, learn how to think clearly. And so I think that that's what I worry about, that people who are not spending their time figuring out other human beings and working with other human beings, that they're, even if they're, playing video games and feeling a little hedonistic happiness, or, enjoying their pornography or whatever else they do on their computer, they're not getting that more elusive kind of happiness.
And in the book, you write that there are 3 instincts tribally that we have hardwired in us. And I think it'd be super helpful to begin to unpack those, and we can talk about some examples for our listeners.
So, I'm a researcher at the university, and when we write academic papers, we're real hair splitters. So I'd probably divide it into like 300 different things. But when I work with business people or politicians or other people that I consult to, I've kind of developed a playbook for explaining things to practical people, and you need to kind of only have distinctions that really matter. So I have kind of these 3 waves of the adaptations that account for the human specific social life. It's the peer instinct, the hero instinct, and the ancestor instinct. And the peer instinct, it started like more than 1,000,000 years ago. And basically what it is it's this kind of intense curiosity about what the other people around us are doing, and a sort of impulse to imitate them and to want to mesh with what they're doing. So it's both some capacities for learning, learning from imitation and observation, and also some motivations like conformity feels good, or agreeing with somebody feels good. And the peer instinct, we see that because we see signs from, even like 1,000,000 years ago, we can tell from like footprints and that sort of thing, that humans started hunting, like in hunting parties, in a way that involved more coordination, like more like being on the same page and having a common goal, than other primates. Other primates, they hunt together, but it's more like parallel play, where like you and I are chimps and we're both going after lizards, and I might spook a lizard in your direction, but I wasn't doing it for that reason. It looks like there's synergy, and there is synergy, but it's not, when other animals collaborate, they call it mutualism. There's benefit, but it's not really we're working from the same script, And so the peer instinct is very old, and it essentially corresponds to some of what we call conformity. And of course, we're all brought up to think conformity is a terrible thing, and it does limit our independent thinking as individuals, but it enables our collective thinking. And, most of the really impressive things that humans do are involve, thinking with other people, building on the ideas of other people. So I think, we should have a more even-handed view of conformity. It's what allows us to mesh with other people, coordinate with other people, be one mind or one united force. And then, about a 500,000 years ago, there were new things happening socially where suddenly you see, an individual making a sacrifice for the group, like a valorous hunter, kind of putting themselves at risk so that the group, brings down a woolly mammoth. And at the same time, you start to see in the archaeological record skeletons of people with congenital deformities who lived to the age of adulthood. And so that kind of tells us, okay, someone was taking care of a person who probably couldn't reciprocate, right? So people are doing something because it's good for the group, not because they're getting paid back directly in some way. You also start to see way more sophisticated tools that people had to, delay gratification and kind of toil away to build this tool. So all of that, is the start of this kind of pro-social motivation. This motivation, I want to contribute to the group, and I want to enjoy the esteem and the status that comes with being a contributor, and the tribute. There are opportunities and resources that come to the contributors in every human society. And so we may, just like with conformity, we may think, oh, that's a silly aspect of human nature, but it's really not silly. It's a powerful advantage that we have. Similarly, with our status aspiration, we may think status seeking is superficial and silly, but it's a mechanism that both serves individuals and serves the group. Because as individuals, I have some ambition and some energy. I'm gonna try to earn the esteem of the group by building a better spear, or today it might be coming up with a cure for COVID, right? And the group benefits because, there are individuals trying to figure out what would be valued by the group, and we have learning procedures that go with it. And one of them is what anthropologists call prestige learning, that in every culture, people tend to look at whoever has like success and status, and then you kind of infer, well, whatever they're doing distinctively might be the reason for their success. So I'm going to emulate it. And, we see that in the business world. We see that in sports. So like when Steve Jobs used to wear those black turtlenecks and have the macrobiotic diet and to meditate. And, I can't tell you how many tech CEOs I've met who either wear black turtlenecks or meditate or have macrobiotic diets. And as we saw in the case of Elizabeth Holmes, who imitated several things about him, it doesn't guarantee success, because we don't know if what LeBron eats for breakfast is why he's so good, but we know that he eats something unusual for breakfast. So we're inclined to emulate that. And it's not foolproof. It'll lead to superstitious learning, but it tends to lead to adaptive cultural evolution. Because if somebody does something that is successful in the new environment, maybe the business environment has changed, or maybe there's global warming, and so something has changed, and somebody's doing something, planting a different crop, and it's succeeding, other people will emulate that. And then what happens is the group shifts in that direction. The culture of the group shifts towards what's working now. So it's kind of a progressive force, this status aspiration, hero instinct aspect of our psychology. And then the final part, which came in the last 100,000 years, and to a lot of people, it sounds like the most primitive of all of these ways that we're wired. It's the ancestor instinct, and it corresponds to the kind of deep curiosity we have about what the past generation was doing, why we listen to the stories of elders, why we sort of commit myths to memory, why we watch rituals and then we want to replicate the ritual. And it's a capacity for sort of carrying the wisdom of the past into the new generation, and then passing it on to the next generation. And it can lead to a lot of sentimentality and nostalgia and hanging on to things that, don't work. But it was really valuable to have evolved in humans because it created tribal memory. Before that, even though people had the hero instinct and they were trying to contribute things, but you had to reinvent the wheel almost every generation because people weren't hanging on to the distinctive innovations of the previous generation. And once you had people wired with this kind of compulsive interest in maintaining traditions, that kind of created group memory. And so it's an aspect of our psychology that can seem irrational at times, but it was an important piece of the puzzle. And then once you had all three of those tribal instincts together, the sort of conformist instinct, the status, aspiration, contributing instinct, and the let's remember what grandfather used to do instinct, then you started to have what's called cumulative cultural evolution, which is that the culture in groups started to grow richer and more tuned to the local ecology with each generation, because you had all three of these things going on. And once that was like a Rubicon when our species got cumulative cultural evolution, because we left all the other species behind, because we were without individuals getting any more brainy, they became more capable, every generation, because the stock of cultural knowledge that they could draw upon was getting richer and richer and richer. And so that's what really makes us human, this kind of capacity to live in groups that share rich legacies of culture. And that's tribal psychology. Now, yeah, does it sometimes lead us to get angry at other groups? Yeah, it does. But it's originating out of these three instincts. And if we want to solve these snags that we get into, it's helpful to remember these three instincts and to try to trace how they're contributing to the problems.
It seems to me that each one of these add-ons to the tribe did so in order to protect the tribe. So the first one, conformist. Yes, I want to know where I am. If I get in this collective, that I'm safe from other outside forces. Now that I'm in the tribe, in order for there to be any order, I must understand where I am in the tribe. So that's the community status situation. And I want to work in order to move up the chain towards the top of that community where I'll be revered. And then lastly, with the traditions and where we've been through, having that origin story allows for us to protect ourselves so we're not subverted from outside forces.
It strikes me that mimicry is a key part of all three instincts.
Yeah, because they're all like learning from social information, And it's funny, we say monkey see, monkey do, but there's all these studies that show that we are far more imitative than other monkeys or even chimpanzees. Like when you set up like a puzzle with chimpanzees and they learn how to solve a puzzle one way, and then you show them some other chimpanzees solving the same puzzle in a different way, they're like, I'll stick with what works for me. But with humans, if they see other children solving the puzzle in a different way, they switch. They switch to the way of the majority. So we're a lot more copycats than other monkeys, and so we shouldn't ridicule them.
And looking at things historically, most of the tribalism, we had only experienced one tribe in our lifetime. But now we're in a situation where we're in such close quarters and we're constantly influenced and seeing and interacting with multiple cultures and multiple tribes through our lifetime.
Yeah, I think that, this is a big one. I think nowadays, one way to summarize some of this tribal instinct stuff is that we are the animal that's wired to internalize the ways of the communities that nurture us, right? We're sort of wired to learn cultures and drop a kid down in a new culture and they will learn it very quickly. But we are nurtured by a lot of different communities as we go through our life. It might be the school that we're in, and then maybe the religion that we're brought up in, and then the soccer team that we get on, and then we go to a college, we learn a profession, we join an organization with a strong culture, we join the military, we join an ashram, we go to these different communities and we internalize things. But these internalized cultures, they can't all drive at once because they contradict each other. Walt Whitman, the poet, he said, if I contradict myself, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes. And I think that's a great description of modern life, right? We all contain multitudes, like different groups within us. And we have to follow one set of cultural scripts in one situation and another set of scripts in another situation. Sometimes we get creative and we like fusion cuisine, we put things together that haven't been together before. But for the most part, we do what's called code switching, right? Where you get in front of a group of people that are from your hometown and you start talking like people in your hometown. And then you get in front of a group of people from your profession and you're talking jargon, and you don't even have to try to do that. It just comes out.
Yeah, and I think instinctually we think of the cross-cultural as like meeting in the middle and like homogenizing, but in actuality that code switching doesn't actually mean you meet in the middle and you're doing both half time. You end up defaulting to whatever the predominant culture is that you're immersed in.
Yeah, it can be a both and rather than a blend. And I think that's an important insight that, generally people have come to. I think when I was growing up, there was this sense of like people who were bicultural, like they were immigrants, or even people who are like multi-ethnic, right? That they were somehow stuck in between these groups. And I think there's a more of a realization now that a lot of people are 100% this and 100% that, and perfectly comfortable going back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, their first encounter of code switching is from a narcissist, where they have been duped, they've been drawn in because they related to this person, and then they see that person 6 months later in a completely different setting, and they've code switched, and now they're using different signals. And so, if that's the case, they've been burnt, and that burn has been crystallized in their mind. That is now going to be a red flag that they're going to be looking out for. So it certainly can have that opposite effect as we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think that in the US, we have this very strong individualistic culture, right? And there was a book written by a Columbia professor once called Sincerity and Authenticity. And it was about sort of the essence of the American ethos. And I think that there are many places in the world, like, say, Japan or China, or whatever, where neither of those things, sincerity or authenticity, is as emphasized, right? Because there's much more of a sense that the virtue is to be situation appropriate. So if I'm in a business situation, I should act like a businessman. And if I'm in a, family situation, I should act like a husband or whatever. And I think that, like in Canada, Justin Trudeau, he's a native French speaker and a native English speaker. And nobody bats an eye when he switches to French halfway through a sentence because he realizes that he's speaking with Quebecois audience rather than a Toronto audience. But I think in the US, we do have this strong sense that you shouldn't be two-faced. You should be the same person through every interaction that you have. That does create more suspicion, I think, when people are changing the subcultural codes that they follow.
And there's also something very endearing of seeing somebody step into a world that they're not familiar with and fumble around, but trying their best to understand and respect it. And with that, it's like, well, it's perfectly normal that you wouldn't be comfortable with this. But considering that you're giving your best and you're able to laugh at yourself in this uncomfortable situation, well, I have respect for that because you don't belong here, but you're trying.
Yeah. I think we trust people when they make themselves vulnerable to us, right? So when somebody's willing to go into a situation and acknowledge their lack of perfect competence, but try, I think that's is part of the joy of traveling abroad, right? Where you're kind of reduced to a childlike state, and people have to take sympathy on you because you can't really figure out where you're going.
Well, it's also one of those moments where you start to recognize the impact that culture has on you. So oftentimes when you're immersed in a culture, you don't actually understand its real impact. And for some of us, it's going off to college. For some of us, it's traveling internationally, where you actually see the cultural differences. And you have a great example in the book of a photo of fish. And there's one fish, it looks like, to an American set of eyes, leading the pack of fish behind it. But in Eastern culture, looking at it completely differently from a collectivist cultural mindset, it looks like that one fish may have pissed off the group and they're chasing him out of the group. It's the same picture, but culturally speaking, we're viewing it through a completely different lens.
I think you captured that better than I ever have. And that was my dissertation. It was like we were trying to develop like a Rorschach test, to test whether there were like cultural differences in the the interpretations people make, the social judgments that people make. And we went through lots of different animals and lots of different stick figures, and then we landed on fish. And it turned out to be a good way to, to draw out this difference in the people's assumptions about what's cause and what's effect. Is it the individual leading the group or the group chasing the individual? Yeah, and then we've found, in later generations of research, we look at bicultural people like Asian American kids, in New York or California, or kids in Hong Kong, who are growing up with both cultures. And what we find is that if we run the study in Hong Kong, if we run the study in Cantonese and we show them the pictures of the fish, they have the bias of seeing the group influencing the individual. And if we run the study in English, they have the bias of thinking the individual's influencing the group. So they have both sort of sets of cultural scripts within them, and which ones come top of mind are affected by little aspects of the situation that are like cues that tell us, okay, you're in a Western situation or you're in a Chinese situation.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that is, coming out of the election, I think a lot of us have been algorithmically and culturally steeped in views of what we anticipated the results to be. And now we're all sort of coming out of it and recognizing that even in a country like the US, where we think of one large culture, there's vast cultural differences in perspective of what happened in an event we all lived through.
Yeah. It's just striking how those of us who try to be aware of what's going on and what the country is thinking, but we're so much in our bubbles that, and we're selective about what media we look at. And there's a lot of confirmation bias that goes on. And so we have these election night surprises. And these days it happens almost every election. 4 years ago, it was the Republicans who genuinely thought they were going to win and were shocked. And then immediately you go to the inference, foul play. Somebody did something. And 4 years before that, Democrats were shocked. And now it's Democrats again who are shocked.
And I think a big part of, what comes out of these events is this desire then to start a grassroots movement. And oftentimes it's labeled in a political way, but in large part what we're doing is we're trying to harness those three instincts to create the culture and the tribe that will affect the change that we're looking for.
Yeah, and I think that in my field, like I work in a business school, there's a lot of people who are experts on organizational change, cultural change, and every class on that will start with 75% of change initiatives in corporations fail. And why do they fail? Well, because there's active resistance. Like someone in the CEO suite wants to change the strategy or change the structure, but you've got all these middle managers who are kind of invested in the status quo, and it's what got them to where they are, and they're going to dig in their heels and try to wait it out and not change. And I think that a grassroots movement is one of the ways that you can get successful change about a really deep cultural pattern. And it's called grassroots because it starts from the bottom and it works its way up. And so the usual thing about a grassroots movement, we could point to like Gandhi in India, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or the migrant farm workers in California. It starts with the people at the bottom, making a change in their everyday life, and then it seeps upward to the shared discourse. So celebrities started to get involved in the striking of the grape pickers, or celebrities got involved with Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and some politicians. And so people who are influential and who control the shared values get involved. And then eventually, when they really succeed in making change, it's because they've started to change the traditions and the policies. It's often legal change that in these groups. You can tell a similar history of, the struggle for same-sex marriage. A lot of people say, oh, it was these forward-thinking lawyers and Supreme Court judges. No, it was a 25-year process, starting in the 90s with LGBT groups, the come out of the closet movement, make yourself more visible. And then it started trickling up into Hollywood, and you had shows like Will and Grace that were showing the same-sex relationships were the ones that everyone admired, which wasn't the case in the prior generation of sitcoms. And then you had lots of states passing same-sex marriage, and you had lots of churches recognizing it, lots of corporations recognizing it in terms of benefits. So you had lots of policies and traditions changing before the Supreme Court changed. And so it's kind of bottom up. It works its way up like that. One way to think about it is that you're kind of changing the peer codes, the peer instinct norms, and then you're starting to change the hero instinct norms, like who's a role model and who are we aspiring to be like. And then finally, it's changing the ancestor instinct, changing like, okay, well, lots of states have been doing this and it seems to be a good thing. And, when the Supreme Court justifies it, they justify it by like the 14th Amendment said that, everyone has to get equal protection under the law. And that was in 100 years ago, and it's time to apply that to this domain. So I think that these tribal instincts correspond to different stages of a grassroots movement. And it's a grassroots approach is a great way to make change, but it takes time. That's the only disadvantage. It proceeds on the order of years and decades rather than months.
But the benefit is, even a tiny minority can impact a large majority in the change that follows.
It can be like a snowball that gains, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, it started with like one woman who had no political experience, but her daughter got killed in an accident. And then she saw that the guy who was the driver had been in other accidents and was getting a slap on the wrist. And so it can start with just a few people who are compelling, and then others join, and then it spreads laterally, and then it starts to move its way upwards. They call it astroturfing, right? When you find that, like, okay, these anti-climate change citizens are really just paid by the oil companies. Okay, they call that astroturfing because it's like not real grassroots movement. But that's more common than you would think, So like the Tea Party movement, that was the Koch brothers. The Koch brothers, they trained a bunch of people to go back to their communities and start these anti-Obama, anti-tax things. And, a lot of the people they trained succeeded, but then lots of chapters sprouted up in neighboring communities that they hadn't trained, so it's not like AstroTurf. It becomes real grass. And I think Trump's movement was like that too. He obviously put, some of his own money into it, but in the end, he spent a lot less. In this election, he spent a tenth of what Kamala spent. And you have a lot of really passionate people who really felt like he was protecting the American dream or something.
What I think is important to point out is you can't skip the peer instinct. So there is this desire to be the hero, to step in and influence. But in actuality, we have to start a level below at the peer and get a small group of individuals together before we just jump in and say, I'm the hero, I'm going to save things, I'm going to change things, X, Y, and Z. And in a lot of those movements that get labeled as AstroTurf, they're not actually peers. They haven't done anything peer-related at all. They try to skip the step with money and influence and amplification to bypass peer movements and pay their way to the hero step.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that, I agree with that analysis of, the national political situation, that it's about living in these information processing bubbles, where you're getting a lot of validation for what you already think. But I think that, successful political campaigns, even at the national level, sometimes they tap into something that already exists, and sometimes they can kind of ferment something, but there have to be some shared beliefs among the rank and file, the ordinary people, in order to get passion, in order to get people mobilizing their neighbors to go vote.
Right. That's what I'm getting at with the pure instinct, where if you bypass that by lumping people together and saying, oh, we're peers with no actual real solidarity behind that, you're missing the point of what a grassroots movement is, where it's a recognition that we're bringing the mother most impacted by drunk driving to the forefront of the movement, not paying her behind the scenes and hoping that we can bypass by being the hero. It's recognizing that it's a group of peers at first who come together. And the great part about this is that's how change has happened both directions, red, blue, you name it. It started in that way. And unfortunately, with the amount of money now being poured into politics, we think that with amplification of the message and owning the algorithms and platforms that we can influence it and bypass that peer. And oftentimes what you end up seeing is these jokes of the astroturfing on both sides of the aisle looking really foolish.
I think movements don't have to be pristine. They don't have to be like a Maoist insurrection in the countryside. A lot of movements, even good movements, it's a kind of partnership of concerned people on the front line and, experienced organizers who come in and help, or, foundations, or, wealthy people who happen to agree. And it's not just a modern phenomenon. You look at Gandhi could succeed living his life of poverty because he had millionaire industrialists supporting his cause. And sometimes you need money. So a movement doesn't have to be pristine, but it does have to catch on. And I think a grassroots movement, it operates through escalation of commitment. So if you some Greenpeace person, stops you on the sidewalk, they get you to sign something. After you've signed it, then you feel like, yeah, I should give some money, and then you've given some money, and then you're at a dinner party and you're like, we should really care more about the whales, because you've taken this small step and then this medium step, then you're going to take a bigger step. And so grassroots organizing, it's not just telling people to vote, it's getting people to volunteer, and so that they start taking action towards a cause, and then their commitment to the cause is higher than it would be otherwise. All these people going around with petitions, part of it is to bring new people in, but part of it is to strengthen the commitment of that petition seeker, because the act of seeking other people's signatures galvanizes my commitment.
Yeah, and in most of those movements, it's the peers being the signatures ahead of yours. So very rarely, if you're stopped on the street and you're the first signature on the clipboard, will you actually join the cause? But we start to recognize that other people just like us are signing the signature in our neighborhood, and the list is growing, and I want to be part of that. I want to be part of that 100,000 peers who feel the same way as me.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder whether the first page of signatures is fake, because nobody wants to join a cause that has no other people in it.
So looking at the last part of the book in Toxic Tribalism, kind of started there with the political discussion and the discourse around tribalism, but it sounds like a lot of these instincts have helped us move forward, capitalize on this group tribal knowledge to advance society. When does tribalism actually become toxic outside of the political stuff that we discussed?
I tried to think about a couple of examples in the book. I tried to think about, the red-blue conflict. I tried to think about, sort of the record racial protests about inequality in the workplace, and I tried to think about the sectarian conflict, the religious conflict that we see, in different parts of the world. And I think that each of them comes from a tribal instinct that starts rippling out of control. And it usually happens through some kind of feedback loop. So for the political thing, I think one thing that's pretty clear about the difference between now and, say, a generation ago or two generations ago is, first, that the country has had massive residential sorting. Democrats moved to the coast, Republicans moved to the heartland, and then we started to have sorting by party in terms of your news sources, whether it was cable television or websites, blogs, and then social media feeds is the most viral. And so we become enveloped by these environments where almost everybody shares our political views, and our conformist instincts cause that to happen. But then once we're in those environments, the conformity becomes really dangerous, because this impulse of just taking on the beliefs of the people that are around us, whether on our television screen or our neighbors, and we're not even aware that we do it. We just internalize it, and then we think we're being objective because we consume more news than anyone ever did before, but we're really getting a sort of narrow range of the full spectrum of news. And so I think that's a case of a feedback loop where the peer instinct kind of changed our environments, and then the kind of conformist learning that we always engaged in became really problematic because of these new environments that we're in. And when you diagnose it that way, it's not like it makes the problem go away, but at least it suggests solutions that you wouldn't think of if you thought it came from some sort of innate desire to hate other people. And, one of the solutions is, we need to get out of our sordid neighborhoods, right? So I live on the Upper West Side of New York, and, it's pretty democratic, and there's just all these every day, everything I see, it just sort of reinforces that blue tribe mentality, whether it's the Whole Foods, the Lululemon. If you look at congressional districts, Whole Foods and Lululemons are almost always in blue tribe neighborhoods. Cracker Barrels and Hobby Lobbies are in red tribe neighborhoods. So it's important to, take vacations in places that expose us to different parts of the country. If we want to think of ourselves as curious, open-minded people, we should try to, break out of our bubble every now and then and, change the channel. It's painful to watch Fox News if you're a Democrat, but you should try to do it, or at least, read The Economist or read some libertarian things to get a sense of the other perspective. And, so if you think that it's coming from this sort of like unconscious conformity, there are things you can do to, free yourself from it, and things you can do to try to affect the people around you to kind of break down the bubbles.
I think from a toxicity standpoint, the two things that stand out for me is the dehumanization of the outgroup and the isolation from kin and friends who maybe are in quote unquote the outgroup. So you see this in cult-like behavior. You see these movements to isolate you from what is the outgroup, immerse you in the in-group, and over time through that immersion, you feel that the only acceptable culture is this cult-like phenomenon that you're a part of. And you're isolated from family members. You're not inviting your aunts and uncles to the Thanksgiving dinner coming up because of who they voted for. You're dehumanizing the other side in the language that you choose to use and isolating them. And I think that has led to a lot of the toxicity that's just turned a bunch of people off from politics in general. I understand the need to move people to vote, and oftentimes we have to prey on hatred and fear to motivate humans to take action. But the downside of that is, now we're approaching Thanksgiving and we got to sit across from each other. We're all Americans here, and it is a toxic environment when we've started to label either side in such ways.
The other thing I want to add to that as well is when people become afraid, they cling to their safety that much harder, which is their in-group preference. And if that tribal embrace is not there, well, then there's no relief. So if the tribe is going to be strong, well, then of course you're going to have not be so welcome to outgroups. And if that group is loose, then you will be. So what good is the safety and the utility of that group if it's not close-knit, if it's not exclusive, if it's not regimented in order to be in there when you actually feel like you earned that spot?
Yeah, it's like, do you need boundaries to have a cohesive group? Is that, the idea? I think there is a trade-off there, and I think it's a challenge to develop big tent movements, as opposed to movements that are narrower. But I do think that tribal motivations can be used in inclusive populism, just like they can be used in divisive populism. And I can point to a lot of examples, but given that Thanksgiving is coming up, I always like the example of Abraham Lincoln because, we think our politics is divided today, but he took over with less than 40% of the popular vote. 7 states seceded before his inauguration. The Civil War started, a few weeks after it. And in his first inauguration, he was looking at this really difficult task. And he said, the mystic chords of memory will swell the chorus of the Union, and people were like, what is he talking about? But he really believed that if we thought about the past, if we thought about our common ancestors, we would be able to get beyond the current misunderstanding. And one of the things that he did, in addition to all these great speeches like the Gettysburg Address, where he talked about our forefathers came to this land, drawing attention to the ancestors, he started the holiday of Thanksgiving. And now we all grow up thinking that, the Pilgrims invented Thanksgiving. Well, the Pilgrims had a feast, when they had their first successful harvest. They didn't call it a Thanksgiving. And it got kind of confused over time because Puritans did hold something called a Thanksgiving, but that was like a prayer ceremony. And the feast that they held was, they were like drinking and shooting off guns. And it was a very different kind of thing. And around the 1860s, a bunch of like thought leaders of the time thought, okay, the country's growing really divided. Maybe we should have a national holiday in the autumn that is like about reconciliation and togetherness and memory and Thanksgiving. And, they had been lofting this idea to several presidents, but it was Lincoln who thought, yeah, that's what we need. And, it wasn't like the South the first year that in 1863, it's not like the South really got on board, but after the Civil War, they did. And, within a decade, it was regarded as like a national ritual, like a sacred tradition, and it brought people together. So, looking at the past and thinking about, what we've inherited from the past can be a way of building unity. It's not always going to be a way of building division.
Well, it's a great place to end it. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael. Where can our audience find out more about the book and the work that you do?
Well, there's a website for the book. It's called tribalbook.org. I also have a website, michaelwmorris.com, where you can read about my research and the book. I'm at Columbia University in New York, which is known for tribalism of a different kind, but you can look me up at the university website as well. And I love to get emails from people, and please take a look at the book or enjoy this podcast.
Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me.